Episode titled George's New Hands. Everything in the Pig family house started out like any other day. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa and George were playing in the living room. Everything was calm, but that day George started to feel a strange pain in his shoulders. He tried to continue playing, but the pain was growing stronger. He quietly complained to Peppa, and she told him to go to Mummy Pig. When George walked over to Mummy Pig, she looked at him with concern. "What's wrong, George?" she asked. "You don't look well." "My shoulders hurt, Mummy," George replied. "I feel something strange." Mummy Pig looked at his shoulders but saw nothing unusual. She suggested he rest, but soon George realized that something even stranger was happening to his body. Later that same day, as he played with his dinosaur, he felt something begin to grow on his arms. It started with a small pain, and then his skin seemed to move as though something was under it. At first, George thought it was some kind of strange dream, but when he touched his arms, he realized it was real. Soon, new small limbs began to grow on his arms. It started with fingers, and then full little arms that began to move as if they were alive. George was frightened. He quickly hid his arms behind his back and ran to Daddy Pig. "Daddy, what's happening?" he asked, desperately trying to conceal his new arms. Daddy Pig turned around, noticing his distress. "What's going on, George? What are you hiding?" When George showed him his new arms, Daddy Pig froze in place. He was silent for a moment before saying, This is strange. You shouldn't be changing like this." George didn't know what to do. He tried to control the new arms, but they moved on their own, as if they had a mind of their own. He tried to talk to them like his other body parts, but they wouldn't listen. And that's when George realized that these arms weren't just changing his body, they were beginning to make their own decisions. Mummy Pig heard their conversation and came to the kitchen. When she saw George's new arms, her face turned pale. "George, you need to lie down," she said. "We need to figure this out immediately." But George already knew that this wasn't just an illness or a temporary condition. He realized that his body was changing, but he didn't know what would happen next. That evening, as Peppa and George were getting ready to sleep, George's new arms began to move in the dark. He felt them reaching out toward the walls, as if trying to grab something or learn something. George knew something more was going on with these arms, and it made him anxious. That night, George woke up to find that his new arms were no longer just arms. They had become something more. They began grabbing things around the room, moving on their own. He tried to stop them, but they were too strong and persistent. George couldn't hold back his fear any longer and decided that he needed to tell Peppa about what was happening. When Peppa saw what was happening to George, she was also scared. Together, they decided they needed to find a way to stop it. But was it even possible? And what if this was just the beginning of something worse? Episode titled A Strange Dinosaur. It was a normal morning. Mummy Pig was making breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, Peppa came downstairs and said, "Good morning," and George was sitting on the floor playing with his dinosaur. He moved the toy and quietly said, "Dinosaur." Everything felt calm. After breakfast, George went outside. He walked to the playground where children usually played, but this time it was empty. The swings were moving slightly, even though there was no wind. George stopped and looked around. He placed his dinosaur on the ground and said, "Dinosaur" again. At that moment, he heard a sound, a slow step. George looked up. On the other side of the playground stood a dinosaur. But it was not a toy. It was bigger, much bigger than it should be. It stood still and looked at George. George did not feel scared at first. He just looked back. Then he quietly said, "Dinosaur." The large dinosaur did not answer, but after a moment it slightly tilted its head as if watching him. George stepped back. The dinosaur stepped forward. They stood facing each other. George said dinosaur again, but this time more quietly. The sound felt strange, like it was repeated. George looked around. No one was there. He turned and walked back home. He did not run, but he walked quickly. In the evening, everything seemed normal. George sat and played, but sometimes he stopped and looked at one point for a long time. Peppa noticed this but said nothing. At night, Peppa woke up because of a quiet sound. She walked to the window and looked outside. There was a figure in the yard. It was too large to be a toy. It was not moving. Peppa did not open the window. She just watched. After a moment, the figure was gone. In the morning, everything felt calm again. George was playing on the floor. His dinosaur was next to him, but now it looked slightly different, as if someone had touched it during the night.